Oh, pardon me, I hope you weren't having a good day because it's about to get a lot worse.
When is a good time to use CG in your anime?
Pretty much whenever you feel like it, and if it's done well, then you should use that shit all the time.
Never. Thank you guys for watching. Feel free to support me on Patreon, subscribe to my channel, make sure you guys share, like, and comment.
Yeah, probably don't do that for his channel, but if you do like the content here, make sure that you hit that subscribe button with the bell and all the other good stuff that's listed below. And also, if you want to support me on Patreon as well, you can do that there, or you can hit that join button for just $2 a month.
Okay, but seriously, it's not that simple. With anime becoming more and more mainstream and budgets for shows constantly shrinking, it's often impossible for studios to match that demand.
Alright, let's take this one really slow, okay? Because I know that you're not very smart, but it's thanks to the increase in demand that the budgets have been going up for anime. It's right here, even in this article by Otaku USA Magazine. Yoshitada Fukuhara, a producer at the anime studio 8 Million, has been sharing insider information on the world of anime budgets through Twitter. In 2019, according to Crunchyroll, Fukuhara tweeted that it typically costs around 142,000 USD to make an episode of anime. That's 15 million yen. Now though, because anime is increasingly doing so well around the world, some anime studios are able to up their budgets for anime making. Fukuhara explained this in detail, updating the previous tweet about finances. A translation was supplied by Crunchyroll. Also, fuck Crunchyroll. The tweet shown here reads, "This tweet is from a year ago, but recently the market price for an anime episode has been around 20 million yen, or 190,000 USD. This is because overseas distribution sites are focused on the popularity of the original work, the studio and the creator when they license the series at a high price, so the majority of the orders are concentrated on the more popular studios. Furthermore, the bigger studios tend to be able to claim royalties easily. On the contrary, it is difficult for smaller studios to claim royalties. Overall, budgets are increasing, but the royalties made through domestic broadcast TV licensing are changing and are gradually disappearing. The new idea is that once an original work has a proven track record, the studio will be able to claim royalties. In order to achieve this, the trend in the future will be for production studios to not only produce works, but also to create a system that allows them to do their own copyright business, to merge or be acquired by a major company, or to work with a production company. The number of original works is decreasing, and it would be nice if there were more original anime created by studios. So I don't know where you got this idea that anime budgets were decreasing and that we should stop where we are. I think that that's just a really stupid thing to say.
CG is a necessary evil.
I think it's a necessary evil because anti-tubers love to bring up CG in anime and say absolutely nothing at the same time.
But surprisingly, that's not the argument I will be making today. First, I just really want to delve into this topic because no matter how ugly CG is, it's kind of cool when used properly.
I'm not going to be too facetious here, but that kind of applies to anything. If done well, the results are good. I don't know why CG has to have that special little asterisk next to it.
So today, that's kind of what I want to focus on. When, where, and how to use CG in anime, along of course with how the use of CG has evolved over the years.
You know, I almost forgot that this was a film student. So he's going to tell us about how the anime industry works while, not knowing how anime is.
So let's start by talking about CG and of course when to use it. Let's just be honest with ourselves, it's often because of budgetary restraints.
Was that the case for Berserk, one of the most well-known franchises in the anime industry? Because if we're going based off of budget, that one had pretty much the name recognition. But of course, that could just mean that they didn't have the right company to fund them. And a lot of it goes into investing and whatnot, so it's kind of weird.
Of course, there are exceptions, and we will get to those, but often it's a case of way too much action in a single scene to animate on a budget.
Or sometimes it can just be down to the technique that they use. Because most of the time, when you want to cut cost, what you do is you render everything in real time versus doing something that's pre-rendered. So a lot of the stuff that you see that looks bad is probably most likely something that's made in real time, which will probably not look as good as something that is pre-rendered.
so CG can get the job done with an often notable difference in quality. Of course, there are some really good rules of thumb to use when working in CG to make it not take your audience out of the story. Because after all, that's all this art form is about. Keeping your audience immersed in your story, and weird jarring cuts back and forth to CG can absolutely ruin that. That's why it's often so universally hated.
Tell the geniuses over at Crunchyroll that same thing. Keep that same energy.
Now on to talking about where to use CG. It's quite simply only on solid objects.
You can still use CG on moving objects, it's just a matter of where you use them at. So in the case of something like Hentai Collection, they use CG a lot when they're in the water, but it's never for extended periods of time, and you almost don't even notice it sometimes. But I guess if you have a keen eye, you'll notice it.
Vehicles, buildings, any object that is not organic. Computers are really good at simulating solid objects and really bad at simulating organic objects. Yes, I'm looking at you, Berserk.
While there is no reason or explanation given as to why things like Berserk 2016 looked bad, what we can usually find from people along the internet, they usually have quite the answer for it, in that it's just bad CG. There is one section that claims CG is not a magic cost-saving tool. It requires time and effort just like traditional 2D animation. The benefit of CG is that once you've built your models and your scene, don't forget proper texturing, the front end work is done. Like a traditional film set, you can move your camera, move your characters, render the scene, and move on. This saves a lot of time and effort compared to 2D animation, where each new scene requires at least some new animation. Berserk 2016 isn't the worst example to come out for CG anime, but I think we all know what XIII is all about, don't we?
And also, of course, how to use CG. It's pretty simple. Establish with your audience when you will be using it, then stick to it. Don't cut back and forth between animating it in CG sometimes and 2D other times. Pick a style and commit to it. So let's talk about one of the first anime to use CG and how they accomplished it without pulling their audience out of the narrative. Initial D.
You know, he kind of set me up for a lewd joke and I was gonna make it, but let's keep it professional. But no, seriously, your mom can have my initial D.
So first, let's talk about when they use CG. Obviously, when they race. Those are the most heavy action scenes in the show, and without CG, the show probably would have never gotten out of pre-production. They also only use CG during the race scenes with the exteriors of the cars. They do cut back and forth to 2D animation when they cut to the interior of the car, but all exterior shots are CG, and so it's established with the audience and it never pulls you out of the races. And finally, the CG objects are cars. Solid objects that, although they look horrible because the show is from the 90s, doesn't look like some terrifying body horror. And that's why the awesome races of Initial D are still incredibly immersive despite the use of 90s CG.
So I think we can all pretty much agree that no matter if it be 2D animation or 3D CG, we can pretty much narrow it down to it can be done well or it can be done poorly. And in this case, Initial D did it well. But there is also another case that I think you might have forgotten that predates Initial D, and that is Golgo 13, which was originally released in 1983 and had its first use of CG. Everything now looks pretty archaic because we're so used to things to be fully textured and having more things happening on screen. But with this, and the limited technology we had at the time in 1983, this was technologically advanced, and it still swapped between the traditional 2D anime style and the 3D CG. It's like something out of a very vaporwave album.
So, of course, I have to give you guys examples of poorly used CG in modern anime, and oh god, it just hurts to look at. I'm honestly not sure if you guys even want to see this. Okay, here it goes. Golden Kamui, why? Jesus, who let this monstrosity on television? Not only that, in the first episode! Okay, so let's take a little bit of time to talk about why this is so wrong.
I don't know, maybe my perception of what bad CG is, for this anyways, is kind of warped, because I think it looked fine. Like, sure, it looked, pretty weird because it's in a 2D environment, but it definitely didn't make me cringe the way that I thought it would.
First, it breaks our number one rule. Don't use organic objects.
Wait, it's a rule now? I thought that was just like a suggestion, like you were suggesting that they don't do that. No, I don't think they need to listen to you. You're pretty stupid.
Computers are not that great at it still, if you can't tell. Secondly, look at the quality of the animation and the rest of the show. I feel like this was absolutely not a budget problem. If it was less of a lack of budget and more of a mismanagement of budget. And thirdly, if you absolutely have to use terrible CG in your show like this, just try to show it as little as possible. Do not frame it so we can see every inch of this eldritch horror-looking thing you call a bear.
I don't know, the bear does a good job of being frightening to me, but maybe that's just my perception.
Oh god, let me just get that off the screen.
Let me get it off the screen, and then you immediately put it back on the screen. This is some grade A editing you have here. I'm glad you're doing such a good job.
Worst of all, this terrible CG completely breaks the audience's immersion, ruining the whole purpose of creating a scene like this in the first place.
Golden Kamuy was pretty well received. For a 7.83 out of 10, according to the people at my anime list, that's pretty high. Now, I did see at least one different review, and I guess it's kind of a controversy if you really want to make it that, but the bear CG didn't look nearly as bad as what people were making it out to be. Just from my view, but I can see how people would have an issue with it if they're going out of their way to look at it that much.
So now that we got that out of the way, I kind of want to talk about how CG has changed in the past few years, and of course some exceptions. Starting with one of my favorite anime of all time, Land of the Lustrous.
Well, I'm glad that you're starting to warm up a little bit and seeing that just CG in anime can be good if implemented properly. But again, like 2D animation, it can be done poorly as well. I mean, have you guys ever seen some of the awful creations that 2D animation has given us?
This fully CG show came out in 2017, and although it didn't get much recognition from the community as it aired, it did slowly build up a cult following. The show is clearly very different visually speaking, since it's completely CG, but it cleverly uses the weaknesses of CG to its advantage. First off, all of the main characters are actually crystals, solid objects instead of organic objects, which makes them look much better.
No, I think that the studio knew what they were getting into and the funding got put into the CG working properly. I don't see why we have to keep trying to beat this dead horse.
But uniquely enough, there are some organic objects that are still animated through CG. In particular, the antagonist of the show, along with the mysterious godlike figure of the show. The CG gives them this extremely off-putting look that makes them way more terrifying, helping tell the narrative.
Okay, then my counter argument is, then what about the bear? Golden Kamuy's bear, yeah, it may look like probably shitty CG, but it was terrifying when you did look at it, maybe for probably the wrong reasons. But again, this kind of defeats your whole point of, well, it needs to be on things that are inorganic. So things that aren't humans, or in this case, the protagonist and the antagonist of this series. So is it still a rule if you break it?
By the way, which is great and you should totally watch because I never actually got to do a video on the show and I really absolutely love it. Finally, leading me to Demon Slayer, Ufotable's newest property. This show is kind of what I've been leading up to.
Let me guess. We're going to talk about how great Demon Slayer is and how it can still break all three of those rules that you said earlier, and it's going to be one of the best shows that you're going to talk about. I can almost guarantee it.
CG is getting way better. For instance, Demon Slayer broke all of the previous rules I mentioned in these two scenes. First, they use an organic object, i.e. the main character. Secondly, it's not established as to when they transform back and forth to CG, leading to the possibility that your audience immersion will be disrupted. Yet, it's not. Because it honestly doesn't look half bad. It's getting there, and instead of being shamelessly in your face like Golden Kamuy, it's pushed further to the mid or background and meshes surprisingly well with the 2D animation.
So I guess we just forgot about Summer Wars, right? Because that also predates this. Summer Wars was an anime movie that premiered in 2009. And if you watched it, then you would know that it blends CG and 2D animation perfectly well. On the Digital Frontier website, in the regards to merging 2D anime with 3D CG, In Summer Wars, CG is used to create the background, crowd, avatar, and the giant love machine in cyberspace, Oz. CG is also utilized for PC screens in the story. The total length of the CG part is about 30 minutes. In the last section, the largest difference between celluloid anime and CG is the texture. In order to match the texture of the two, we use toon rendering so that it looks like if it's all done in celluloid.
It's honestly really cool to see how far CG has come in anime, and that now, with proper direction, you can even break some of these rules.
They're not rules, they're something stupid and arbitrary that you came up with because you wanted to sound intelligent with your film degree. But let me tell you that the harsh reality is that usually when it comes to CG looking bad, it's not so much of a budget issue, it's more of a time issue. And if you run out of time, well, what do? You go to either outsource it or you put in some crappy CG, whereas shows that have a little bit more time to stew, aka Demon Slayer, then the results can be magnificent.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't really have a message for this video. I just really wanted to talk about why some CG is totally fine and others unforgivable. It's just something I'm particularly passionate about and wanted to talk about while figuring out what seasonals I wanted to cover in more depth.
And unfortunately, you failed on almost every single one of those fronts because, of course, over here in this neck of the woods, we actually do our research before we make a stupid video. Because at least if I'm going to sound stupid, I would like to have some kind of links to it. I guess the TLDR is that AniTubers, again, don't do any of the research. But don't worry, us smart people are going to do it.